Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 145. I'm delighted to be joined today by physical performance coach Norbert Banoocy. And that was take two, by the way, and I nailed it on take two. Norbert, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Ben, it's a pleasure to be on the podcast. Feel very honored to be here. You've had quite a list of renowned speakers on your podcast, so it's absolute privilege and honor to be here. Thanks.
No problem at all, mate. It's great to have you on. We've got some cool stuff to cover today because we're going to focus around periodization. But let's go into your journey so far. There might be some people that know some of the clubs you've been at, some of the roles you've had, but there might be others that don't. So do you want to just take us through your journey in your career so far and also give us where you're at the moment?
Yeah, let's see. If you go back to, I guess, my beginning of career in SNC, sports science, whatever you want to call it these days, I started within a NCAA Division I university setup back in California. So that was kind of my first crack at the profession. From there, I sort of worked within university and high school levels for about 5 or 6 years at various capacities and also different sports and not just football, which at the time was a very, very good experience to kind of learn and understand what it takes to work with different levels of players and sports, and then how does all of that apply to football, which was my main sport growing up and also the sport that I continue to be interested in. Sort of after that, I transitioned into Major League Soccer with Atlanta United, which was back in 2018, if I remember correctly, where I started with the club initially as an assistant sports scientist. And I spent probably the first 6 months of my role kind of helping the first team, the reserves, and the academy. And, I learned from some brilliant people down there at the time. And after the 2018 MLS championship that I was fortunate enough to be part of, we sort of had a shift in the structure and the staff. And I was given the task of becoming the head of sort of academy sports science, if you will, for the Atlanta United's youth football structure. And I spent the next 2 years working with the club on that aspect and then in the youth development side of things. And then that role sort of came to an end back in 2020. And shortly after that, I started my current role at the Hoiko Football Club in Helsinki with our women's professional team. And I've been here since January. Yeah, that's a short summary.
No, that's great. And we've just been talking just before we started recording about the extremes in weather over there. So I'm guessing that's a big influence on what you do, extreme winters, but also you've just been mentioning the temperatures today. So I suppose that's a big part of your preparation, isn't it, with the climate out there?
Yeah, I guess it's also part of my luck. My first time ever in Finland, or Helsinki specifically, I've had the coldest winter with the most snow, and I've also had the hottest summer with the highest temperatures. So it's been an interesting adjustment period. I mean, coming from California, which is usually almost sunny, but it's still quite warm here for sure.
Yeah, brilliant. And in the role at Atlanta, in terms of when you first went into the club, was it like a clean slate? Was it a program that you had to design from scratch, or was there something in place?
Yeah, at the time, probably the first 6 months, it was somewhat of a clean slate in regards to there wasn't much direction in terms of what was needed from me. So I was kind of there to help anyone, and that included the first team staff, the reserves team staff, and also the academy, which was great for me because at the time Tata Martino was the head coach, and to kind of be around that and be able to like assist and kind of see what they do and learn from that gives you a very good learning environment to take away from, and also be able to implement that within the rest of the players within the club structure, which was a fantastic experience. But then when I transitioned into the academy setup, it was pretty much a clean slate. and I was given the task to put in processes and basically from every sports science S&C aspect that I could possibly think of, obviously given the resources and everything. So that was basically my task for the next 2 years that I was there, to put in structures in place and make the operation as smooth as it could possibly be.
And what was the initial focuses for you? Because I think this is quite interesting when people talk about their first approach, maybe the non-negotiables or whatever you want to call it. What was the initial focus for you going into that position?
Yeah, I think the initial focus was probably identifying, okay, what is the identity of the academy? How do we want to play? But then how does that translate into a long-term athletic development plan? Because for me, that's probably the most non-negotiable aspect of it. And having a framework that you can work off of, and it doesn't have to be rigid, and it doesn't have to be by the book, if you will, all the time, because I know there's a lot of debate within the literature about different LTAD models and what's good and what's not good. But I think at the end of the day, having some sort of framework that you can kind of identify yourself with and then also build from is probably the most important element. And then I think secondary to that is, because you work with such a large number of coaches within an academy setup, you have to have some sort of planning or slash periodization strategies that you kind of utilize, and that would keep everybody happy to a degree and would have everybody on the same sort of wavelength in terms of planning and designing sessions and things like that. So then I think those two are probably the most important aspects, and then you try to fill in the gaps from there as much as you possibly can.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And we said at the start that we're going to talk around periodization, and I know there's so much stuff out there about periodization, and obviously the different approaches, the different models that are out there, and I'm sure many people have used different types. They've been exposed to different types, but I thought it would be really good to tap into your experience and some of the approaches that you've used, and also what has influenced the decision on certain approaches. So just initially, maybe just covering some of the different models that you've used, and then we'll go into the reasons why that you chose those and what influenced it.
Yeah. Look, I think a lot of us in this field specifically, we come from a background of periodizing the biomotor abilities and, like, you know, working within the gym environment and then on the pitch and off the ball mostly. And we kind of, our way of thinking revolves around periodizing the physical aspect and physical aspect only. But I think the more, you know, football grows, and then the more people realize that that sort of one-dimensional approach doesn't really cut it anymore, and it's only one piece of the puzzle, then you start to realize that then you have to find ways to work with the rest of the coaching staff and make sure the demands of the team and what they require is met first, and then you try to work backwards from there and see where you can, you know, make improvements and add whatever you possibly can, if that makes sense. But I think, to answer your question, obviously, like you said, there's very many different methods, you know, the traditional periodization methodologies, and also more of the recent trends, or not so much trends, but also ideas that have become commonplace in football, you know, such as the Raymond Burhine periodization model. That's very, very popular, as we know, within the coaching community, because it's quite simple to understand and implement for somebody that doesn't necessarily have a background in sports science. And secondary to that, and probably less common, is the tactical periodization model that is gaining popularity, even though it's been around for quite a long time. But now it's getting to multiple countries and multiple levels, whether that's youth development and also professional sports. For me, I think the tactical periodization model is probably the most in-depth and the most the one that makes the most sense to implement within a footballing structure, even though there is no scientific literature backing the entirety of the model, but the rationale and the way it gets implemented, I think it goes very well with the coaches, because it allows them to basically implement the game model and the style of play that they want to implement with their team and their squad. And I think for me, that's a model we can work with, and that's a model I personally try to utilize in a sort of late youth development stages of an academy setup, and also within a professional environment, because it allows you to specifically come up with a list of main principles that is related to your game model. Of course, that's the coach's job, but we learn from that, because we also can adapt our physical aspect of that. And from there, then you can fill in the gaps. If a style of play and if a game model is set in a certain manner by the head coach, and the physical model that you're trying to implement doesn't match that, or doesn't act as a supplementary methodology, then the two may not work well together. So I think our job at the end of the day will have to be complementing and supplementing what the coaches want. And I think the tactical periodization model is probably the only one that I can think of that has created the platform for the two to work together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I suppose that's when we also have to remind ourselves that we are support coaches, or a support system for the manager or the head coach, don't we? Because like you say, if there is going to be that clash of approaches, we know we're not going to get the most out of what we're doing.
Yeah.
So that is when we do have to sort of be able to, maybe it's to do with ego or whatever it is, but we have to re-look at our approach and make sure that it fits in line with what the coach is setting, don't we?
No, absolutely. I think, and it's a humbling lesson, right? Like a lot of us, it's football is a business of egos, in my opinion, and that's at every single level that you can possibly think of. If it's under 12s all the way up to senior level, so and then it's quite fine. I think that's also how you learn, because then certain things work better than others, and you have to find ways to make it work for your environment. And at the end of the day, I think even the coaches, and certainly in my experience, is that they realize that you can have a model and you can have a methodology such as tactical periodization, but you also have to understand if that model can fully be implemented within your club and whether it's national team or club level. And that is very much dictated by the squad of the players you have, by the level of the play, by the culture of the club, and the resources that kind of surrounds everything together. And we can discuss the most in-depth and the most brilliant tactical periodization model with the most detailed game model plan with principles, sub-principles, and so on and so forth. But when you look at, certainly from my experience, some of the players can't even execute some basic elements of the game, then can you really truly implement like a tactical periodization in its true sense?
Yeah.
Or do you start to shift to more of a hybrid method where you kind of pick and choose like what fits in your system from different methods?
Yeah.
And if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I suppose that's the real art of a coach or sports scientist, isn't it? To be able to understand each system to the point where you know how to manipulate your approach on who you're working with. And not, like you said, not just who, because I was going to talk about some of the influences or some of the things that influence your decision on what approach you take. And I know you've mentioned a few of them there. But when you've got a certain squad in front of you, or you've got certain restrictions in place, like that's when you have to sort of delve into your toolbox, isn't it? And try and find that, like you said, that the hybrid approach, or however you're going to manipulate it to get the most out of your approach.
No, absolutely. And I think it all comes down to what you have available. What are the tools you have that you can work with, and what is the coach wanting to achieve and accomplish? And I can give you a lot of examples. For example, like preseason, right? And there's a lot of debate on like how you should approach it and what is a good loading pattern, and like, you know, if it's 6 weeks versus 4 weeks versus 13 weeks in Scandinavia. So there's all these like arguments on what is a good way, right? So if you look at, for example, on the topic of tactical periodization, the ideas behind it suggest that you have one introductory week in preseason, and then starting week 2 you're straight into the model, and you have to like implement every element to the T, and that's how you do it until end of the season. In reality, can you really do that in an environment where you're maybe given 6 weeks and your players have come off a break and most of them haven't done much? And then you look at the variance between your veteran players versus your, you know, younger players that are part of the squad, and the players that maybe are coming from different backgrounds. Can you make that happen in a span of 4 to 6 weeks where all of those players are on the same wavelength? Yes, of course, there's places that do that, but some places that's just not a reality. So then if a certain day within your microcycle says that you need to be working on your sub principles, and it's building out of the back, for example, and how you do that, and then your players are expected to complete a passing drill as the first sort of component of the session, and they show up and the passing is not great.
Yeah.
But you're so adamant about doing it because it's directly related to your game model. So what do you do at that point? You know, do you change it? Do you stick with it? And then maybe have a reflection that the next time, okay, maybe you need to have a simpler passing pattern where it has nothing to do with your game model, but it's specific enough to the sport where you kind of get what you want out of that to improve the quality and the decision making of that, and then shift the gears back to your, you know, main principles and sub principles, if that makes sense.
I think this crosses over to a lot of approaches, doesn't it? And I'm thinking more like strength based now, that if we want a player to be, say, hitting a certain weight or percentage of body weight on an exercise, but they've never done that exercise before, or their level on that exercise, their training age is really low. We're not just going to suddenly load the bar up and say, this is where we want you to be, is it? And I suppose that's the equivalent to what we're saying in terms of periodization. If like you said, if you're trying to run a drill and you're not getting the desired effects, and it's not at the intensity and the technical level isn't there, it needs adapting, doesn't it, to get the players up to speed?
100%. I think there's so much like overlapping and similarities between the strength-based stuff and what happens on a football pitch, and not necessarily like in the same way, but the ideas and the thought process behind it. I think there's a lot of overlap, and and then it's the same thing. And it like one simple example is this whole idea of block periodization and how useful it is in a strength training environment versus in a football environment, and I think there's some merit to it. And as I think the coaches really think on a microcycle level, and justifiably so, because it's all dependent on the results and things like that. But how much do they actually think about the long term and what implications the current microcycle has on the next one and the next one and then the one after that, right? So then can we influence that decision with a little bit of maybe quote unquote block periodization model, where we do try to plan it in maybe 4 weeks or 5 weeks or 6 weeks at a time, where certain elements carries over, and then you see that adaptation from a physical standpoint, but also tactical standpoint, and not just what happens this week and then we forget about it the following week because we don't need to do that anymore.
Yeah. And this is something I spoke to Tom Little about actually ages ago, who's at Preston, because he was speaking about like managing the microcycle, and he spoke so much about planning the microcycle, but it's got to be so flexible because of how everyone who works in football knows that things change like that. Like whether it's games, like you said, results can influence it. Maybe it's facilities or just logistics of getting people into certain places. Like we know there's loads of things that happen. But in terms of your approach, would you plan, say would you plan like a macro cycle, or would you have just like a rough idea of where you want to get to at certain points and then focus on the microcycle? So I'm trying to think about coaches now sitting down to maybe look at a season. Like, what would you say in your experience, like how in depth do you think they need to go looking longer term, or do you need to focus, just have in mind the kind of things you want to be achieving later on in the season, but then focusing on the short term because that's what you've got the control over?
Yeah, I think if your preseason is long enough, and that could be anywhere from 6 weeks to 12, 13 weeks, and in a scenario like that, I think it's very important to sit down and really like discuss what is the coach want to accomplish by end of week 6 or week 13. And he could have a detailed plan of like how he periodizes his principles and things like that. But then I think there has to be a discussion of, okay, what implications is that going to have on the physical element? Because we can't just keep increasing load forever until 13 weeks later and expect everything to go well, right? So I think there's a constant battle of educating the coaches to make sure they realize that there has to be periods where you have to deload and you have to decrease what you expect from the players to let them recover, so then they can go again and do it for another few weeks. But I think once you transition into in season, and of course that's very much dependent on your fixture congestion and your travels and things like that, but assuming you only play one game a week, then I think you can potentially look to plan maybe 4 weeks ahead of time. And not saying that you have to have a deload at the 4th week, but I think you can have certain elements. So for example, if you do follow the tactical periodization and your Tuesdays are generally speaking small dimensions and smaller sides, and your Wednesdays or your match day -3 are larger dimensions, then are there specific exercises that the coach really likes and he keeps using? And then can you periodize that in a way that's progressive and that allows the players to improve, and that physically, tactically, technically, whatever, and then you have like almost a block of that, right? And then you can sort of discuss, okay, what is next, what does he want to achieve next, and then can you do the same thing with this other things that he wants to achieve, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. Have you got like a specific example, and obviously without naming names or clubs or anything like that, is there anything that jumps out for you on that, just to give a little bit more detail around that? Because I think it's a great point. I'm just trying to think if there's anything specific that you could maybe give an example on.
In regards to that long-term, short-term planning?
Yeah.
I can use an example. For example, for us, like we use match day -4. We have generally our main principles, and it's a large-sided theme, which there's a lot of attacking transition moments in a larger field size. But we usually do play some sort of medium to large-sided game depending on our player availability for the day, and we've had blocks of that where it's been sort of somewhere from 8v8 to maybe 10v10 plus goalkeepers. And then I've sort of identified what are some relative pitch areas that we can use for that specific number that could potentially expose these players to high intensity running, potentially some sprint distance, some high intensity actions where they really get to go. But obviously that is very much dictated by how the session is, how that drill is run by the coach. Because if there's a lot of stoppages and if there's not a lot of ball in play, then the intensity could be very, very low. So then that plan kind of goes out the window. But assuming all those factors are kind of discussed and in place, then you can look to increase the amount of sets and the duration of the sets across the weeks until you get the desired effect in relation to potentially what you would do in a game. So if, for example, our effective ball in play time is about 55 minutes, I believe, so then we try to like start at a lower end, maybe 20 minutes, or maybe even less than maybe 15 minutes, and then we'd start somewhere from 2 sets of 7-minute games with a minute or two in between rest, and then we build that across the weeks. And then obviously I try to use the data to see how effective has that been in getting what we want out of these players in relation to the game, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, cool. And obviously using data and stuff is a whole different topic, because we could go into that and probably do a whole different podcast on it. But no, I fully agree. The other thing I was going to say in terms of an example, you said about maybe a manager having a certain drill or something in mind that they want to try and implement into the program. And then you've got to obviously then try and fit it in, haven't you, and make sure you're getting the most out of that approach. Can you give an example of that as well?
Yeah, for example, like here in Finland, they're used the culture is influenced by this methodology called Econo Method, which is a Spanish school of thought in regards to how they design sessions and how they train, and part of that is this idea of waves, where a lot of it is like game related scenarios, whether it's defensive, attacking, or transition moments, where it's like almost done at 3/4 of a pitch size, where it's usually at 20-25 minute blocks where they try to implement some idea within that. So what we've kind of looked to achieve with that, our head coach, for example, he really likes that style of training. So then my thought process behind it was like, okay, how can we make this that we also benefit physically and not just going through it 25 minutes with a lot of stoppages and not really getting much out of it, right? From a physical standpoint, that is. So then we identified, I asked the head coach, for example, specifically, like, what is his ideal chunk of time that he would want to implement within that 20-minute period. And he would usually say, I would like to have, for example, a 4-minute block where the players kind of go and it's an intense actions, back and forth, and then there's a rest period where I instruct them. And I was like, okay, so let's see what is the length of the field size for that drill. Can we turn this into potentially like a scenario where the players are exposed to an extensive sort of speed endurance maintenance or production scenario where I make a recommendation that, okay, for example, if you're looking for extensive actions, then maybe the maximum length of time that you allow the play to go on would be around maybe 30 seconds. And then you give them maybe 2 times that as a recovery. And for example, 60 seconds where you get to instruct the players and then you go again. And then that kind of suffices both the physical and also the technical aspect that the coach is looking. And obviously within that, then there's been a ton of literature coming out from work of Paul Bradley with regards to the whole high intensity movement profile and the contextualization of what the players do to make it meaningful for them as well as the coaches. So and that's another sort of area that we started doing a lot more and more of, and adding elements of recovery run and running in behind and things like that within that scenario. And that almost makes the coaches smile, and that they're like, yeah, I like that idea, so let's try to implement that within my game model.
Yeah, that's where the specificity comes into play, isn't it? And that's why coaches love that, because it becomes very visual, doesn't it? Like you can see the game happening in training essentially then. And yeah, Paul does some amazing work, and if anyone's not seen the work that Paul puts out, they need to go and check it out, because yeah, it's brilliant. And I think that example, obviously there's loads of different examples similar to that, isn't it, on how you can just adapt a drill. But that was perfect, just because it gives people that mindset on, oh, I'm not drastically changing what we're doing, because we all know that if you go into a coach and you say, no, we're not doing that, then that's not going to happen. Like, they're going to do it regardless. So you have to have the skill as a practitioner, don't you, to go in and get what you both want out of it, because we've got the same goal at the end of it.
No, 100%. And I used to be very hard-headed and say, oh, the workload has to be this way and you have to accomplish it doing top-ups and doing this and that. But I've shifted so far away from that, then it's almost like I've evolved into being like a third assistant coach, where I listen and I, observe what are they thinking, what is the reasoning behind this drill and exercise that they want to do, and okay, how can I make a suggestion that would have an underlying physical element to that. And I've become a huge supporter and believer in accomplishing all of your sort of physical markers, if you will, through the training sessions and minimizing how much you do off of that. Of course, we have to do that to develop certain elements, because you can't always achieve that. But I think the more sort of specific it becomes to the style and to what the coaches want, I think the happier everybody is. And the same goes with the players and not just the coaching staff, because the number of times I've had to deal with players, they're like, oh, we're running again, oh, we're doing this again, and it's like, okay, can you make 5 extra recovery runs today, so then we're both happy and then you don't have to do anything extra? And they're like, yeah, I can do that. And then boom.
Yeah, because coaches and players, they want to play, don't they? That's what they're there for. So if you can get what you want out of it, then obviously it pleases everyone, doesn't it? But there's a real skill in that, isn't there? And I love the idea of the sort of third assistant coach, because taking that viewpoint removes the fact of like old school, where you had a fitness coach and a technical coach, like, and they've just got two different views, and you look after the fitness, you look after the football. That's not the case, is it? There's got to be that link between, isn't there? And obviously we can talk about relationships and between coaches, and obviously that is really important, isn't it? But what everything you've spoke about comes off the back of having that relationship and then being adaptable within the approach.
No, I couldn't have said it better. I think, at the end of the day, I think we will still continue to be responsible for the physical aspect and the fitness and all of that stuff. But the more you speak the language of the coaches, the more they trust you, and the more they come to you as almost like an advisor and or a third assistant, whatever, right? And even like, it's not our job to be the tactical coach, but if we increase our knowledge level on that front, then we can have more influence and we can get more buy-in from them and alter decisions if there's a need for that, right? And there's this whole I guess rivalry between the coaches and like the traditional SNC fitness coach coming in, and they're like, can you even kick a ball? Like that was like my first interaction here in the team. It was like, oh, can you even kick a ball? And then they saw me doing a few return to play sessions. They're like, oh, okay. And then it almost like built that relationship without me saying anything, which is not the greatest thing, but like it makes you laugh and makes you realize maybe the value of really knowing the sport and like kind of walking the walk as well as talking it. So
I think it's a great point, because I always hear people speaking about working in different sports, and I always try to think to myself, like, if I went into a sport that I didn't know anything about, I didn't know anything about the culture, I just feel like it would take me so long to get used to it and sort of be able to be as impactful as working in a sport like football or soccer that I know more about. It's just interesting, isn't it? And I think the other point I was going to make on what you were talking about there with maximizing football practice is that it does exactly that. Like, where if people are listening, maybe working towards the lower levels of football, and you've not got much time with players, we've not all got the luxuries of spending every second with players like some clubs have. It allows you all to get what you want out of the sessions, doesn't it? Without adding loads of time on that you don't have.
No, 100%. Like, I think with the exception of maybe very few elite clubs that do have the luxury of having unlimited resources and things like that, majority of the clubs, even at high leagues, and don't have the resources and the time, or the resources are shared amongst different divisions, academy, men's, women's, etc., etc. So then you have to find ways to make it work, because if you keep principles are a few, but methods are many, and there's certainly many ways to skin a cat. And if you can identify different ways of doing that, then I think you'll be in much better place and solve more problems as opposed to causing them, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And
No, go on, mate.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so no, and I think at the end of the day, like establishing certain frameworks and ideas that you really believe in, and finding the links between that and what the rest of the staff or the players expect of you. I think that's where that buying and that relationship aspect kind of gets more gelled and bonded, if you will.
Yeah, 100%. I was going to ask as well, you referenced it before in terms of the work, obviously trying to maximize football practice, trying to get as much out we can of the practices, but there being a small element of work that needs to then be done away from the pitch. So what do you feel like some of the biggest, maybe some of the biggest aspects of physical performance that can be affected away from the pitch rather than including it or adapting the practice to try and get the most out of it?
Yeah, I think that probably the biggest one is the gym or the weight room, and what happens from a strength and power development standpoint, which we know is very, very important in regards to both obviously improving performance, but more importantly, mitigating some risks of injury. So I think that's where the fine line is, and how much you can push and pull in that environment. And I think I've certainly come to a place where I'm more about doing what is the term I'm looking for? Like the biggest bang for your buck with the least amount of exercises and things like that. And I would love to have a 90-minute weight room session 2-3 times a week, but that's just never gonna happen given how many games players play. So then can you identify areas of improvement for each individual player within the squad? In an ideal scenario, then you kind of make plans according to that, and find ways to almost like microdose it, and find the minimum effective dose for that specific player, and then find ways to implement that. And this almost becomes this cycle of, I think Mladen Jovanovic uses the agile periodization, where it's like short-term, like iterative planning and testing and things like that, where it like constantly evolves and it becomes less rigid. So then you move the needle in the right direction, if you will, and you get less hung up on the idea of like my block of max strength this month didn't pan out because of the practices running over by 30-40 minutes each day.
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? Because if we look at an S&C program, a football S&C program, and we take that sort of block periodization approach, then we know that in season there's going to be things that crop up, fatigue, fixture congestion. Like have probably been a couple from this season that has just happened, and taking into account the Euros and everything else. Like we can have that plan. Again, it comes down to being adaptable within the plan, doesn't it? And knowing what you're trying to get, and like we said, whether it's the low-hanging fruits, the non-negotiables, whatever we want to phrase it, like what we want to try and hit with the player. So if we do have a 20-minute, a 15-minute session or 15-minute free time, we know we're going for X, Y, and Z. They're the priorities.
Yeah, 100%. It's like you said, I think identifying what is the most important thing from a physical standpoint, and then obviously from there, how much time you have in the day, in the week, in the month. Can you plan it long term without any interruption? Great, then do that. If not, then you have to have almost contingency plans put in place for everything, because as the great Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face.
I love
that's
that.
Football. That's football every single day of the week. So you just have to be prepared for everything.
100%. No, mate, this has been quality. Have you got anything else to add in terms of periodization? Because I feel like we've covered most of what we were going to talk about in terms of what influences it. We've spoke about how flexible we need to be within the approach, and then obviously some of the factors that you feel like we can impact away from the pitch. But was there anything else that you feel like that we need to cover on it?
I think one thing from experience I would say is the not valuing the player feedback enough, probably, and being so caught up on, like, for example, if this is a 5-day-a-week training schedule, we're doing it regardless of what the players are thinking, feeling, you can monitor fatigue and all of that all you want, but I think that the conversation and the verbal feedback you get from the players is probably the most valuable in that end. And I think having the flexibility and being okay with having an extra day off and manipulating your training, because you deep down that's gonna give them the players that little bit of psychological and mental boost that when they do come in, they're gonna go an extra mile for you because you gave them a day off. It's almost finding that balance, and that certainly has been a learning curve for me as well, because I'm always like, oh, we need to train, and then players can't cope, and then you all of a sudden are like, all right, then you have to start to listen and find that what fits them as opposed to what fits you or the coach.
Yeah, that's another great point. And again, it comes down to relationship. We spoke about relationship between you and a head coach, but then you and the players is equally as important, isn't it? And knowing the players, and if they're coming to you and saying that they're feeling fatigued, or they don't feel like they should be doing certain work on certain days, like, again, it's just that being adaptable, isn't it? And having those tools in the toolbox to adapt your approach and essentially meet each other halfway, isn't it? And get the most out of it.
Yeah, 100%. I think at the end of the day, like, we're not robots, and we certainly don't work with robots. So it's having that, that feel for it. Sometimes we like to be science-based, and I love it, and I don't want to move away from it, but you have to understand that human element, and then to get that translated into real world practice takes an art, if you will. And then it's sometimes you have to bend the rules, and sometimes you have to little bit forget about the science, because that's the reality of it. And they're not rats, they're not lab rats where they respond to a certain stimulus in a controlled fashion, right? So then you have to be flexible with that as well.
I think that's something you experience more and more as you go through your career as well, isn't it? That we, not that we get away from the science, because that's not the case, is it? But you learn how to adapt things a little bit more, and you learn that we are dealing with humans, and not every set of players or not every player is the same. So that's a great point. No, but we'll move on to some of the questions we finished the podcast with now. So the first one being, who are some of the biggest influences on your career so far?
It's a long list probably, but I'll try to make it a bit small. I think probably the two most people that I would give a lot of credit to is a gentleman called Farzad Jalilvand and a gentleman named Jeff Krelling. These are the two people that I met at the very beginning of my journey, and they saw something in me, and they believed in me, and they certainly gave me my first shots, whether it was an internship or just a conversation and a chat. I think they inspired me so much to continue and push on and move forward in my career. So I think them two are probably the most influential. And some of other people are Dr. Greg Haff and Dr. Sophia Nymphius and Dr. Dan Baker, which I got to meet all of them in when I did my master's down in Australia. So those people are world-class practitioners and researchers that I got to learn from, and that experience is certainly not replaceable. And over the recent years, James Malone, brilliant guy. I got connected with him, and I've learned so much from him. So that's another person I would definitely say that you should probably have on your podcast.
Yeah, I was just thinking that when you said that.
yeah. And then obviously I've had the pleasure of working with a ton of brilliant staff back in Atlanta, and also here in Helsinki. So a shout out to them as well.
Yeah, brilliant. I know it's hard to narrow it down, but yeah, some amazing names in there. Next one, what would you say your biggest strength is as a practitioner?
My least favorite question.
This is my favorite, you see this.
Yeah, I've come up with this sentence in my head for a while now. I think I'm a good generalist in an age of specialization, where I've had to cover so many fronts for so many years that I've become really good at being able to do that. And as much as I would like to specialize in certain things, but that's not always the reality of elite sports. So I think that's probably my strength.
I love that. That's a great quote. Awesome. And then just finally, I always like to ask people about CPD or how you're doing your continual learning at the moment, whether it's whether you're able to get on courses or whether it's webinars, podcasts. Is there anything that sort of stood out for you that you might have done recently? I always think this is quite a nice time just to divert coaches' attentions to certain things that you've done or you feel like you've taken the most from.
Yeah, I mean, I always keep my eyes out for whatever, gets posted on social media. I think it's great for these sort of things. And some of the two webinars I've done recently was the Sport Trail Football Science Conference. I thought it was very well put together, and the lineup of speakers was brilliant. So that was a really, really good learning opportunity, and for almost no cost at all for what they provided you with. And then the second one was a free webinar by the GPS company from Italy, and they had JB Morin on speed and acceleration profiling, which I thought was very, very good. So those are the two I've done recently, and of course, like most people in the field, I try to keep up with research and podcasts and books and things of that nature as well. So yeah.
That's why I like to keep it broad on that, because I know people cover a lot of different things in terms of podcasts or webinars and research and stuff. So no, I think it's always nice to get where you've focused your attention recently. No, but I really appreciate you coming on, mate. This has been superb to speak to you and talk through what we've gone through. Just in terms of like diverting people to social media, if they want to connect, if they want to ask any questions or anything, where would you direct them? And also, do you want to give your Twitter handle or wherever you want us to send them?
Yeah, absolutely. I try to respond as much as possible on Twitter and LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn at Norbert Banoocy. I think if you type that, it probably comes. I'm the only one named with that last name probably. So it'll be an easy find. And then Twitter is at coach_Norb, which is NORB, in the first few letters of my first name. So I'll send that across to you so you can attach it in case people couldn't get through my thick accent. So
no, brilliant. No, I encourage people to obviously reach out with all guests. Like, I think it's great to have conversations, and especially around periodization. I think you've gave some great practical examples of how you've manipulated your approach and sort of created your approach in different scenarios. So I really appreciate you being open with that, and I hope people have taken plenty from it.
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. Thank you for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No problem, mate. And let's stay in touch.
100%.